Preparing your critical business applications for failures and disaster is key for business continuity. In this demo, I will showcase how Veritas Alta Enterprise Resiliency provides a disaster recovery solution for SAP. Expanding on an SAP deployment with Veritas Alta Enterprise Resiliency for high availability in North Virginia region, instances for the SAP application cluster and database cluster are deployed in Oregon region for disaster recovery. Note, a minimum of one instance with EBS volumes is needed for the application cluster and one instance with EBS volumes for the database cluster. Veritas Alta Enterprise Resiliency for single node cluster deployment are installed on the instances in the disaster recovery site. There are additional DNS entries that allow for the disaster recovery of SAP with Veritas Alta Enterprise Resiliency. There is also VPC peering configured to allow for network connection and routing between the two VPCs. Now let's look into how Veritas Alta Enterprise Resiliency makes SAP running in this environment resilient to disaster using VIOM, the centralized management console. Navigating to the VIOM window, the instances at the disaster recovery site are registered. Expanding the node for the application cluster and disaster recovery site, there is a disk group created. However, since there's only one node in the disaster recovery site, flexible storage sharing is not enabled. The disk group is comprised of the EBS volumes attached to the instance. Then volumes and cluster file systems are created similar to the disk group in the production site. Once all the volumes have been created and mounted, the SAP database and application is installed and configured on the nodes at the disaster recovery site. Veritas Alta Enterprise Resiliency has a mechanism to replicate the data volumes from the application cluster to another site asynchronously. Core to this mechanism include the replicated volume group, which is a group of volumes within a disk group that would need to be replicated to the other replication volume group in the disaster recovery site, and the storage replicator log, where writes to the data volumes are first queued before they're replicated to the other site. Note, there are volumes for the storage replicator logs in both the production and disaster recovery site. For the database cluster, the SAP HANA replication system is employed to do the replication. To place SAP under control of the Veritas Alta Enterprise Resiliency for disaster recovery, there are additional service groups defined in each of the clusters in the Availability tab to define how the resources within the production site is to fail over to the disaster recovery site. For instance, in the database cluster, the cluster service group includes a wide area connector process, which is a failover application resource that ensures communication between the clusters. It receives and transmits information about the status of the cluster, service groups, and system. Since the replication of the data in the database cluster is being handled by the HANA replication system, only the cluster service group is needed for the clusters for both production and disaster recovery site. For SAP HANA database, only one node acts as a primary database as indicated by the blue color in the SAP HDB takeover service group, and passive in the other nodes in the production and disaster recovery sites as indicated by the gray color. As for the HDB service group, they are viewed as active in all nodes in VIOM since data is being replicated to the other nodes. For the application cluster, there are shared volumes that would need to be replicated to the disaster recovery site, and thus in addition to the cluster service group that provides the communication between the clusters, a log owner and a volume replicator service group are needed in both the production and the disaster recovery sites. The log owner service group manages the resources that writes to the storage replicator log on the production site. Its main role is to maintain the order of writes by designating one node in the cluster as the log owner. This service group is key to the volume replicator. The volume replicator service group contains the resources that are responsible for the replication to the disaster recovery site. As for the service groups for SAP, there's only the data, SAP Central Services, and primary application server groups that are passive in the disaster recovery site as indicated by the gray color. These are the minimum SAP resources required in the disaster recovery site to handle the processing of the user request from the SAP system. Now let's simulate an actual two-node failure on the production site for the database cluster in the East region. First, let's review the current state of the environment. The SAP primary database is running on SAP HANA 1 on the production site as indicated by both VIOM and HDB Studio. From HDB Studio, the replication order and sync or async modes between the production disaster recovery sites are shown. From the AWS console, the DNS entry for SAP HANA database is currently mapped to the virtual IP of the primary database node in the production site, which is SAP HANA 1. Now let's shut down the database nodes in East region from the AWS console to simulate a failure. From VIOM, we can observe that Veritas Alta Enterprise Resiliency detected and alerted that both servers are down. From HDB Studio, the database is visibly down. At this point, from the Availability tab in VIOM, we can bring online the SAP HDB Takeover Service Group in the West region to make the node in the disaster recovery site the primary database. Looking at the VIOM view, we can observe that the resources within the HDB Takeover Service Group is coming up. Once all the resources are up, we can do a refresh of the HDB Studio GUI and see that SAP HANA 3, which is a node in the disaster recovery site, is now the primary database. From the AWS console, we can also observe that the virtual IP address of SAP HANA 3 now maps to the DNS entry for the SAP database. Next, let's look at how Veritas Alta Enterprise Resiliency provides disaster recovery for the SAP application cluster. But let's first review the current state of the application cluster in the production site in the East region. In the Availability tab in VIAM, we can see that the SAP Central Services, the primary application server, and the data service groups are running on the production side in the East region, as indicated by the blue boxes, and passive in the West region, as indicated by the gray boxes. From the replicated volume group in the server tab, we can see that the volumes are being replicated from the production site in the East region to the disaster recovery site in the West region. And from the Microsoft Management Console, we can see that the SAP Central Services and the InQ Replication Server are running on the nodes on the production site. From the AWS console, the DNS entry for the SAP Central Services is currently mapped to the virtual IP of the node in the production site. Now let's shut down the nodes in the East region from the AWS console to simulate a failure. From VIAM, we can observe that Veritas Alta Enterprise Resiliency detected and alerted that both servers of the application cluster in the East region are down. And from the Microsoft Management Console, we can see that the SAP Central Services are visibly down. After we have confirmed that the application cluster in the East region is down, we can now online the SAP service groups in the disaster recovery site. Veritas Alta Enterprise Resiliency has a mechanism to automate this process. In the Solutions section in the Availability tab, we can create and execute a plan to bring up the SAP application service groups in the disaster recovery site. Viewing the service group cluster status of the disaster recovery site in the West region, you can observe that the data, SAP Central Services, and the primary application server service groups are coming up. Now that the SAP services are running on S/4HANA 3 in the disaster recovery site, we can observe from the Microsoft Management Console that the SAP Central Services are back online. And if we look at the virtual IP address of S/4HANA 3, we can see after a refresh of the DNS that the entry for the SAP Central Services has been updated to the virtual IP of node S/4HANA 3. As shown from this demo, Veritas Alta Enterprise Resiliency provides a disaster recovery solution to enable business continuity of your SAP environment in the cloud. Thank you for watching.